Well, let's start our afternoon session, shall we? With thanks to Alexander for waiting patiently for 5 minutes. We've only just finished lunch. So this session is going to be an online one. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome, we haven't met, but I'm really interested to hear this talk. I certainly know some of his ex-colleagues in Birmingham. Dr. Alexander Hall, an assistant professor in science communication at McMaster University in Ontario. He's an historian of science whose work combines mixed methods research and science communication practice. So I'm really interested to hear what he's going to speak about. The title is Explorations of the Non-Human in Global Histories of Evolution and Religion. So Dr. Alexander Hall, please take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, and apologies I can't be there in Cambridge with you all today. Our teaching starts on Monday here, so unfortunately you'll have to just have me as a face on your screen there for now. As mentioned in the introduction there, I'm a historian of science. I do a lot of research on popular science, science communication, and science out in society. You'll see on my opening slide there, I've recently set up a research lab here at McMaster, which is called Science in Society Lab, where we will be studying different issues around science and society from a multidisciplinary perspective. So today, I'm going to be speaking to you about exploring the non-human and animal in global histories of evolution and religion. And given my own research interests, I will be talking a lot about popular media and formats where we might find these issues represented to wide populations in society. Okay, so to begin, I would like to just do something that is the norm for people here working at McMaster University, and that is to read an acknowledgement about the Indigenous land on which we sit. So I would just like to begin by saying that we acknowledge that students and staff of McMaster University meet and learn on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the dish with one spoon, one palm, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. My Indigenous colleagues here at McMaster have encouraged all of us to think in a more integrated way about how this statement might intersect with the themes of our research and the talk I'm giving today. We will touch a little bit on ideas around Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, not in a North American context in this talk, but if anyone does have any interest in that side of things, please do bring it up in the questions and answers, and I'd be happy to see where we can take the discussion in that direction. So to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to begin with some trends in the study of the history of science and religion. And then I'm going to come to what is probably my main focus of research, which is looking at evolution and religious themes in popular media. And then reflect a little bit on the themes of the conference in Cambridge, thinking about animals and other non-human actors in narratives on evolution and religion and the role and function that they might play in telling these stories. And then I'm going to introduce two case studies from a new edited collection that I am working on that is yet to be published, one from Japan and one from India. And then hopefully I'll have time to finish with some concluding reflections about the themes that I've spoken about and how they might connect back to the wider trends in the history of science and religion. At this point, I'd also just like to reference, it was mentioned in the introduction there, the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project, which is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust and led by Professor Fern Elsdon Baker at the University of Birmingham. Up until about 15 months ago, I was at the University of Birmingham directly working as part of that team. I'm still involved with the project, now working from McMaster. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Professor Bernie Lightman, Dr. Will Mason-Wilkes, and Dr. Joel Barnes for their collaboration and input into some of the ideas and content that I'm going to be talking about today. Basically, what I'm presenting comes from 3 different publications, one that's already out and 2 that are in development at the moment. And some of those components have been contributed to by Professor Lightman, Dr. Will Mason-Wilkes, and Dr. Joel Barnes. Okay, so to begin with, a short historiography of science and religion. So there's two major trends in the history of science and religion, and I think many of you in the room might be aware of these already, but I just wanted to highlight and expound on them a little bit at this juncture in the talk today. The first is a turn to embrace complexity, nuance, and specific local context, what the historian of science Ron Numbers dubbed the complexity thesis. The other is a global turn to study locales beyond Western and Christian traditions. The modern historiography of science and religion is sometimes divided into two phases. First, there is a period from 1874 to 1990 when the conflict thesis dominated scholarship on the history of science and religion. The starting point has been seen as 1874, as in that year, John William Draper published The History of Conflict Between Religion and Science. Then there is a period from about 1991 onwards, when people started talking a little bit more about complexity and different relationships between science and religion. And the key text here is John Hedley Brooks' Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, which raised serious questions about the validity of the conflict thesis as a guiding master narrative for the field. But there is perhaps a third and more recent stage, commencing somewhere around 2011, with the publication of Brooks and Ronald Numbers' Science and Religion Around the World, when historians of science and religion began to explore the global dimensions of their topic. The move from complexity to globality has transformed the study of the history of science and religion. Not only has it moved the scholarship away from its focus on Christianity, it has also forced us to engage with the development of science outside of the West. Now, I won't go into too much details about all of the literature in this area, but suffice to say that despite Draper's 1874 work repeatedly referencing Islam and other Eastern traditions, in the decades that followed his work, as scholarship focused exclusively on conflict and contestation between Christianity and science, the majority of the Anglophone work in this area focused exclusively on Christian contexts. Whether it presented a conflict narrative or a more harmonious relationship between science and religion, by the mid-20th century, many of these works were uncritical in their analysis of the development of Western science. And so following the traditional story of the scientific revolution, they felt really no justification seeking histories from further afield. It was again John Hedley Brooke and Ron Numbers who led the way for historians of science and religion who wished to incorporate the global turn in their field in the collection from 2011 that I mentioned, Science and Religion Around the World. They attempted to shift the discussion towards non-Western contexts and non-Abrahamic religions. Studies of early and modern Judaism and Christianity were joined in this volume by content on early Christian religions, Indic religions, Buddhism, African religions, and even unbelief as well. And Brooks and Numbers helped to chart a way forward towards a more global approach to the study of history of science and religion. New scholarship now, though, seeks not only to move Western scientists and Christianity from the center of the field, but it also attempts to analyze how religious and scientific ideas have moved across national and regional borders, and in doing so, how they've been translated and reinterpreted as ideas move around the world. So perhaps rather than thinking like the image here on my slide of a complex network system that I must explain to you today in totality, the global turn in research in this area has helped me to understand a little bit more that my job as a historian is to place these complex episodes in their global context, whilst focusing in on the important networks, connections, and exchanges specific to the story I want to tell. Perhaps a little bit more like this simplified version on the slide now. In the wake of Brooks and Numbers' edited collection, a number of other works incorporating more diverse global perspectives have followed. In particular, with regards to the history of evolution and religion, important recent contributions have expanded Anglophone understanding of developments in the Arabic-speaking world, in Japan, and Argentina, amongst other countries. In doing so, scholarship has begun to unpack how the translation and transposition of evolutionary science to new climes was repeatedly part of a contested process that incorporated the science, and often its accompanying philosophical ideas, into local religious and cultural frameworks. In many settings, such debates were part of wider political machinations which saw evolution used to justify the oppressive status quo or to further emergent political ideologies. And where this scholarship is now beginning to address some of the significant gaps in the historiography is most often centered on the perspectives of prominent scientists, religious figures, and the political classes. Now, the discussions of these elites often focused on what we would call epistemological contestations between science and religion. And thus, accounts of these historical episodes often exclude the repercussions of how these debates and their associated political decisions affected the actual lived experience of the population. So in recent years, new work in this area has also attempted to access more popular understandings, perhaps most notably in the edited volume by my colleague, Professor Bernard Lightman, called Rethinking History, Science and Religion, which came out in 2019. In this, Lightman and the contributors reassessed the complexity thesis and dedicated a whole section to popular publications and popular media and their audiences. However, even recent attempts to narrate the effects of evolutionary philosophies on everyday life in society often ignore the perspectives of minority groups and occupied peoples. Here, historians of science and religion must follow the lead of scholars in other areas, such as subaltern and post-colonial studies, indigenous studies, and perhaps science and technology studies, who've all challenged Western global accounts by centering the displaced, oppressed, and historically marginalized. Such approaches do more than just correct historical inaccuracies and imbalances, as we can see in the work of historical geographers such as Victoria Lawson, who incorporate subaltern voices to help us challenge hegemonic practices today. And in Victoria's work, this is looking at the issues associated with some of the mainstream international development and aid programs. I've limited time to speak today in depth, but I just wanted to highlight two recent publications in this vein, if for those interested. They're on the slide here. The first came out earlier this year, Critical Approaches to Science and Religion. And this is a globally wide-ranging series of chapters. It considers the social, political, and ecological dimensions of science and religion interactions. And the chapters analyze this through the lens of critical race theory, feminist and queer theory, and post-colonial theory. The second collection is not out yet. It's coming out in November. It's edited by my colleague, Bernie Lightman, and Dr. Sarah Kidwai. Full disclosure, this second book is another output from the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project. This takes a truly global perspective on the debates around evolution and religion in the 19th century, and really reinvigorates the study of evolution and religion in the 19th century by exploring very diverse contexts, including Maori engagement with evolutionary ideas and their repercussions in New Zealand, through to Buddhist and Confucian interpretations in China. So now to turn a little bit more to some of my work in looking at science and religion in popular media. One of the major challenges for historians interested in how debates on the relationship between evolution and religion or any other area of science interacted with religion and affect the lived experience of the general population is how to access the often neglected voices that I mentioned in my introduction. In some contexts, there's a complete lack of documentary and material records, making work on this subject exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. One way that scholars have overcome this limitation is to expand the content and the types of source material they look to for discussion of evolutionary ideas in society. For example, rather than focusing on elites and their associated debates, by focusing on historical episodes whereby ideological interpretations of evolutionary science have had direct ramifications on marginalized communities, historians have begun to narrate, albeit in a punctuated manner, the story of how scientific, theological, and philosophical ideas have shaped everyday life. As historians have sought to access these previously excluded voices and contexts, the range of source materials that they've interrogated has expanded to include oral histories, broadcast media, digital media, and other non-print sources. In using broadcast media myself, I have advocated for care in situating media artifacts such as video recordings in their wider social context. In previous work, I have called for care in this work because if we're interested in the perspectives of science and religion, we must remember that these cultural records are not just a reflection of the society that they were created in. They're not just reflecting the concerns of the day, but actually they played an interactive role in that society. They were often central in shaping and informing the society, as well as reflecting some of the concerns of the time. In my 2022 monograph, shown here on the slide, I attempted to look at evolutionary themes across science broadcasting in the UK. It actually began with quite a narrow definition of what science broadcasting is, but really, as I got more and more interested in the relationship between evolution and religion, and evolution and other worldviews and philosophies, I expanded my research to cover all broadcasting in the UK and to try and find evolutionary ideas wherever they had occurred in broadcast output. And this kind of grew out of some earlier work where I did a more symmetrical look at the relationship between science and religion in popular broadcasting in the UK. The chapters of this book explore these areas. So we have early radio broadcasts, early television science reporting. So that's the development and emergence of things like documentary formats around evolution. I have a chapter considering educational broadcasting. I have a chapter then expanding beyond what we might think of as traditional science broadcasting to think about science fiction television. I then look at blockbuster documentaries, and that chapter focuses a lot on Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, which many of you may be familiar with, which I argue is an archetypal approach to talking about science on television that the BBC developed in the 1970s, that was then exported around the world, and really had a real foundational role in the way that we speak about science in popular spaces, and also that borrowed heavily from natural theological traditions of speaking about the wonder of nature. I then have a chapter on anti-evolution and creationist coverage at the BBC, although as the chapter outlines, this was kind of limited and very fragmented over the decades that the book covers. And then I finish with thinking about Darwin anniversaries, and I use the 2009 recent anniversary as a kind of coda to look back on the 1959 celebrations for the Darwin centenary, but also to think about what it means to commemorate scientists in a very public manner. The second work that I'd like to draw on in my talk today is, as I mentioned at the start, not yet published. And this is a forthcoming collection by myself and my colleague, Dr. Will Mason Wilkes, who is a science and technology studies scholar. We're in the final stages of editing. It should be coming out sometime in 2024. The title is Most Adaptable to Change, Evolution and Religion in Global Popular Media. So as you can probably guess from that title, it picks up where my book left off, but gives us a kind of more global oversight of these similar themes. It more directly interrogates religion as a category than my monograph did. And it really takes us in lots of directions as far as what we consider as popular media. So we have content in there ranging from newspapers that we might think was fairly traditional when we think about popular media, right through to things like films, to museum spaces that we're considering as science communication spaces, through to popular novels and other cultural artifacts. Now, with this more global perspective comes obviously a more diverse range of religions and worldviews. I'm still a little bit upset at the omission of a Muslim majority context, if you see the chapters outlined there on the slide. This was unfortunately out of our hands as contributors withdrew during the process, which is, just the joys of trying to work through a global pandemic and pretend that everything is normal. So that is one of the limitations there, but I think on the whole, we have a fairly good spread of ideas and different faiths represented. The inclusion of more religious traditions also leads to some really neat multi-faith chapters. In particular, I wanted to just mention in passing chapter 11, which is by my colleagues Rachel Pear, Nigma Kadan Abo-Toma, and Israel Belfer, in which they detail how natural history museum curators in Israel must, in attempting to communicate scientific knowledge about evolution, accommodate the various and sometimes competing beliefs of audiences of different faiths. And this includes, in their setting, Haredi, Orthodox and secular Jews. It includes Muslims and Christians too. To do this successfully means acknowledging that their different beliefs exist and then tailoring museum content accordingly. A process of accommodation which has actually drawn some criticism. But for those committed to a conflict framing of the relationship between science and religion, it may seem like a concession. However, this approach, as Rachel and her colleagues outline in this chapter, is actually enshrined within the Israeli legal system, which provides unique protections from religious offense. And that's just one example from this collection, which shows if we bring more diverse voices and more regional context into the discussions of these subjects, we find a really enriched conversation. Today, I'll be drawing examples mainly from chapter 6 and chapter 12 in this collection. But all of the chapters in this collection demonstrate the varied and divergent ways that evolutionary ideas continue to be interpreted and reframed during the 20th and early 21st centuries. And in this new volume, our aim was to use the ways that different mass media have been employed in wide-ranging local encounters at the interface of evolutionary ideas and non-scientific traditions and ways of understanding life on Earth. In doing so, we see how different evolutionary traditions and figures have been championed or discredited by different religious traditions, their spiritual leaders, and politicians using the cultural authority of religion as leverage. Further, we see that where episodes have spilled into popular consciousness, they're usually not driven solely by epistemological clashes between science and religion, but actually, this framing is often used to serve and further the aims of political, social, and cultural actors and institutions. And through the chapters, this includes both religious and scientific organizations that are using these issues to further political or social aims. Just to reflect a little bit now on the title of this volume. The title of the volume is Most Adaptable to Change. This is taken from a misquotation, which is widely attributed to Charles Darwin. It was first popularized in the 1960s by Leon Megginson, professor of management and marketing at Louisiana State University. Today, the phrase, which you will still find in lots of business management literature, has also proliferated online as an inspirational meme. And I've just got a screenshot here showing some of the examples that come up when you search that. This proliferation and popularity online and how often this is attributed as a quote said by Charles Darwin has led the biologist Nicholas Matska to write a series of articles highlighting that this is not something Darwin said. And he's also linked to some of the historians of science working on the Darwin Correspondence Project, who have all of Darwin's correspondence digitized online and can clearly show this isn't something Darwin said. For our collection, we've opted to use the phrase as the title, not to draw the ire of historians who want to stymie this association with Darwin, but rather as an opening apologue that encapsulates some of the issues that are central to the case studies in our collection. As the biologist Matska, who's attempted to change the narrative online, and also the historian of science John Van Wy and others have detailed, there's no evidence to suggest that Megginson, the business professor, ever set out to misquote Darwin or to attribute something erroneous to someone who was already eminently quotable. Rather, Most Adaptable to Change was just a paraphrasing of Darwin that Megginson regularly used in his business lectures, which he then included as a paraphrased reflection of Darwin's work in several journal articles that he published in the early 1960s. However, by the 1980s, a version of the phrase appeared in a page of quotes in a business textbook, and it was directly attributed to Darwin. And then the unchecked proliferation of this humble quote and its own cultural evolution as it shortened in wording and it was reproduced online, it neatly highlights the messy and intractable role that multimedia plays in the mistransmission of scientific ideas and knowledge. The misquote's origin as an oft-wheeled out phrase by a business professor highlights the influence that those outside of the natural sciences have often had in shaping popular understandings of evolution. Furthermore, that Megginson's misquote is a fairly good summary of Darwin's position, as included in the later editions of On the Origin of Species, alerts us to the fact that many of the non-scientists popularizing evolutionary ideas in the media, whether in relation to religion or just in communicating scientific knowledge, have usually done so in good faith. And of course, with more lasting impact than some of the more austere efforts by some of the natural scientists. And as I mentioned here on the slide, you can see what happens if you put this phrase into a search engine. I like this one because amongst all of the Darwin attributions there is one that correctly attributes it to Liam Megginson. So I like to think the work of my colleagues in trying to correct the record online is having a very, very limited impact. But maybe they're chipping away at it, and hopefully in the future, the attribution will become more corrected. So you're probably sat there thinking, so far, so good. All of this context is great. But what about the and other animals of this year's conference theme? So as we turn to this section of my talk, I just wanted to have two caveats up front. The first, none of the work I'm drawing on today was carried out with animals as a central theme of analysis in mind. That is to say that the reflections I'm about to provide are drawn from this research that was primarily interested in the representation of evolutionary ideas and their relation to religion and other worldviews. So therefore, I hope that, especially for those of you with a background in something like animal studies, that my reflections are not too superficial. Then secondly, I've purposely used the term non-human here rather than animal, because as we will see when we get to some of my case studies, the boundary between living and non-living is sometimes transgressed in some of the media I want to talk about. And in other instances, the work done by referencing animals is in light of trying to dehumanize people or to categorize people as non-human. So before we turn to some of the global case studies from my more recent project, what about the depiction of animals in evolutionary content in British broadcasting? So I went back to the thousands of archival images I took during the creation of my monograph and started to categorize and look for the different ways that animals featured in a lot of these broadcasts with evolutionary content. Just to give you an idea of the scale of that, the book covers the period from the 1920s through to 2009, and I analyzed in depth around 1,100 broadcasts that contained evolutionary content over that period. So looking back through those broadcasts and thinking about where animals featured, where they didn't, and how they were represented, I came up with three main dominant ways that animals were used in broadcasts about evolution. The first, and perhaps the easiest for us to imagine, or the first place our minds might go to when we think about evolutionary ideas on television and animals on television, is animals as exotic entertainment. The image here is from a 1950s series called Zoo Quest. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was a very influential television show. And we can see in the picture David Attenborough and Prince Charles and Princess Anne in the studio in 1958. Also for this category, when we're thinking about animals as entertainment, as exotic, as other, we might also think they perhaps might come to mind a little bit easier. Think of the long-running children's show Blue Peter, where we kind of have the much, recycled clips of animals misbehaving in the studio, animals not going the way that the script and the plan was for the show. And in these depictions, we often see animals out of context. So that might be animals in the studio, as we see in the image. It might be animals in a zoo space or something like that. But essentially, the animals are there to move the program along, to provide entertainment value, to provide something different that audiences might not be familiar with. The second way that we see animals used in these programs about evolution is as educational tools. This is in didactic content, most commonly educational broadcasting, so content made specifically to teach someone, often about evolutionary science, but also we have content from the 1970s onwards, at least, on the BBC and other channels about evolution and religion, about science and religion, where we can see animals used in this way. We also see this kind of use sometimes in documentary series, especially the early output by the BBC Natural History Unit from the late 1950s through to the late 1960s. In the image here on your slide, you can see the developmental biologist and geneticist, Conrad Waddington. And he is stood next to a skeleton of, I believe, an orangutan. And this is for a series that was actually on ITV in late 1959. And this is a school's broadcast called Discovery. But I just thought it quite neatly encapsulated how animals were used in this kind of broadcasting, where they are used to talk about physiology, they are used to talk about evolutionary process, they are used to talk about internal biology. And as you can see in the slide, I apologize for the quality of the picture there. This why that image didn't feature in my book. But it shows quite neatly how, especially in these early broadcasts, this is 1959, the setup was very much like a classroom. There is a chalkboard, there is all the things you would find from a traditional science lecture in the period. Now, the third category in the representation of animals is perhaps the one we might not think of immediately when we think about evolution on television or radio and representation of animals. And this third category is animals as subservient to humans. This is usually in a way when people are talking about evolutionary progress or trying to depict the progression of evolutionary processes like natural selection. Sometimes this was used in an educational or pedagogical mode, which kind of would overlap with the previous category, but most of the time, this kind of imagery was used when telling bigger stories about science and about humanity and about progress of society. It was often used to justify human exceptionalism, and on some occasions, it was used purely to highlight that animals were subservient to humanity. ZooQuest, the show that's in the first image there with David Attenborough and the members of the royal family, kind of falls under this category, because the premise of ZooQuest, for those that have never heard of this show, was that David Attenborough and his colleagues would go off around the world and they would collect exotic specimens, they would collect animals, and they would bring them back, put them in the studio in front of the lights, and then afterwards the animals would be given to London Zoo, where they would become exhibits. So extremely different to how we might understand conservation practices today, and very extremely insensitive to the thoughts and cultural needs of the places the animals were coming from, not to say the animals themselves who had no choice in this process. But that's a good example of this kind of use of animals in a kind of subservience role. The middle image here that I've actually chosen to represent this category was the inspiration for the cover of my book. And it's by Eric Fraser, who was an illustrator who did a lot of work for the Radio Times, but a lot of other popular publications. And this is from 1944. And it was to promote a radio show on Darwin's Origin of the Species. So this is the image that appeared in the Radio Times, the advertisement for the show to get people to listen. And I just like it because it's a little bit more expansive. It's showing kind of evolutionary progress. It's an artist interpretation, but as well as the biological, we see featured things like the symbols of civilization with the pillar in the background. We see the tools of science represented, but we also see things beyond Earth. We see the cosmos. We see the representation of where this all might fit together. So we see something a little bit more cosmological, perhaps, in this depiction. And often, even in some of the documentary content, where we kind of see this representation and this focus on progress and evolutionary narratives, we often kind of see these kind of images. People might, think of the kind of more traditional images of the development of apes through to primates through to humans. But we see what this is a kind of narrative form that the biologist E.O. Wilson called the evolutionary epic. This is where we tell a story about humanity, a secular story that starts with the Big Bang and moves through the processes of evolution and culminates with humanity. It's a progressive narrative that's kind of at odds with the directionlessness of the processes of evolution. On the BBC, this evolutionary epic, this way of talking about evolution and using evolution to talk about all aspects of life, was widely promoted by the biologist and the science popularizer Julian Huxley. And he was the progenitor of what he called scientific humanism. But I think what we might accurately or more accurately today understand as secular evolutionary humanism. This, as I tried to say then, was a kind of evolutionary worldview. Huxley really thought that the new science of evolution, and especially the new genetics understandings emerging in the 1950s, could really help us explain all aspects of our lives as humans and help us understand society as well. There were two areas of British broadcasting where it was difficult for me to categorize the depiction of animals easily in these shows with evolutionary themes in them. And these two areas were science fiction and religious broadcasting. Now, in both of these areas, we see animals being used in ways that also occurred in international case studies I'm going to turn to next. In religious broadcasting with evolutionary themes, again, we see animals featured in narrative-led formats. But unlike the evolutionary epics that I was just speaking about with their hierarchical structures, more commonly we see animals being deployed in a less literal manner, for example, in an allegorical storytelling tradition. While in science fiction broadcasts, we see animals used in a much more fluid way. We have wildly varying depictions in sci-fi that has evolutionary themes. The most dominant use I could kind of pull out of this science fiction content is really where animals are being used to police the human and non-human boundary. So we might think of one of the series I've looked at extensively is Doomwatch, which was from the early 1970s. And this is a kind of early environmental themed kind of crime detective kind of show, but with a huge sci-fi element. And also Doctor Who. Might be another that we think of in this mode. And often where animals feature in these shows, they're used to sort of demonstrate the boundaries. So they're used often in relation to fictional creatures. So whether we might have robots or alien life forms, and the animals are kind of shown as a demarcation boundary between humans, life on Earth, and other. And where the treatment of these usually falls then in the storyline and where we should be rooting for the human protagonists. So as I mentioned, these kind of two ways, these two areas, religious broadcasting and science fiction, as I went back through all of this British broadcasting content, well, it's quite hard to categorize and find any real clear patterns. But actually, when we turn to the international case studies I wanted to bring in today, we can see a little bit more clearly, perhaps, how animals might be used in some of these ways. So I'd like to turn now to a chapter from the forthcoming book, Most Adaptable to Change. This opens the section of the book on evolution, religion, and reaction, and was written by my colleague, the social historian Saurabh Mishra. And in this, he explores the surprisingly frequent discoveries of feral children in colonial India. And in doing so, Mishra shows that while the idea of feral children had existed in European and Indian mythologies for a long time, there was a distinct shift in the tone and tenor of discussions in the late 19th century, so that these mythic creatures began being linked almost exclusively with the untamed tropics. And he focuses in this chapter on the period from 1920 to 1940 and explores the deep interest shown by Christian missionaries and people from other religious groups in these children, which occurred at the same time as their greater use in scientific tracts on evolution and child psychology. Mishra explores these varied dimensions of the subject while underlining the ways in which the idea of feral children transformed itself in its travels from the tropics to the scientific metropoles of the West. And Mishra introduces several cases of purported feral children from the Indian subcontinent, but mostly he draws on the infamous case of Amala and Kamala, who were discovered by the Reverend J.A.L. Singh in a jungle near Midnapore in Bengal in northeast India in 1920. Singh went on to publish an account of finding these children with the American anthropologist Professor Robert Zing, and they constructed a whole book and narrative around this episode. In doing so, they drew heavily on previous popular accounts in stating that prior to their discovery, the children were raised by wolves. Here on the slide, we can see the frontispiece from the publication, Wolf Children and Feral Man, by Reverend Singh and Professor Zing. And as Mishra shows in this chapter, they really drew heavily on accounts from the 1840s, particularly that by W.H. Sleeman, who allegedly encountered 7 instances of children raised by wolves when he was traveling in just one kingdom in India. Sleeman, it seems, never questioned the veracity of these accounts. And to quote Mishra, this was because of his deeply Orientalist views regarding natives, their propensity for crime, and their tendency to live in close proximity with nature and wild beasts. So, in these cases, wolves were used to help situate not only Amala and Kamala and other feral children as other, but they were also used to situate and other the non-Christian villagers who reported them living out in the jungle. And often these regions where these stories are coming from, the villages finding the children are often not only non-Christian, they're often lower caste Hindu or from ethnic minority groups in the region. And throughout the episodes that Mishra narrates, he repeatedly cites how race and religious difference is used in a hierarchical framework. So, for example, he sort of questions why this reverend kept such a minute day-by-day record of finding these children and thinks about it. And others have said this is purely for money. He knew he could publish this account. But actually, Mishra quite convincingly argues that there's also an element of the Reverend Singh trying to prove himself and to gain favor within the racist hierarchy of the Christian mission in the region that he was in. And like the inclusion of animals in depictions of the evolutionary epic in British documentaries, here the wolves play a role in elucidating these hierarchical structures. However, rather than just helping to reinforce human exceptionalism, they were also used to other indigenous peoples' behaviors and traits, thus setting the feral children's accounts in a kind of redemptive narrative whereby they were saved from not only savage animals, but also the supposedly backwards native communities in which they were found. And Mishra draws on the work of Zachariah Iman Jackson, who uses the term humanimal to explain the racialized images of animality amongst natives. As the image on my slide here shows, that the child raised by wolves trope persists today in popular culture. And in large part, this is due to Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book collection of stories and its subsequent Disneyfication. Disappointingly, especially given the subsequent complete deconstruction of all of the evidence that's been fabricated in the case of Amala and Kamala, which is detailed in Sarab's chapter, this infamous case of these 2 children found in the jungle continues to be at the center of populist content online, as people's fascination for humans reportedly raised by animals shows no signs of diminishing. And yet, while on the surface, much like their earlier 20th century equivalents, these YouTube videos and popular pieces claim to be discussing the cases through an evolutionary lens of understanding childhood development, implicitly and often unknowingly, they in effect continue to promote the divisive pseudoscientific racial hierarchies under which they emerged. And in the process, they involuntarily co-opt wolves into this human-made mess. Okay, to turn to my second case study from the international collection. This is chapter 12 of the collection. And in this chapter, the linguist Hiroko Miyashita and myself, we analyze the religious and scientific influences on Japanese manga, and that's graphic novels or comics, and Japanese anime, that's animated films. And we explored the manifestation of evolutionary themes within some of the most popular content of the genres. And we looked in depth at two franchises in particular. The first on the left here is the 2001 anime film Spirited Away. This is the poster from the original Japanese release, but the film was a huge international success and has been translated and dubbed into many languages around the world. And on the right here, we have the science fiction story Ghost in the Shell. This was originally a manga series in 1989-90, and then was an animated film in 95, and the franchise has gone on to produce other films, video games, etc. In this chapter, we begin with a brief history of Darwinism in Japan and of manga and anime's development. And we highlight how the Shinto and Buddhist themes in the illustrated 12th century hand scroll Shoujo Giga greatly influenced the medium. We can see an extract from the Shoujo Giga scroll on the background of this slide here, and it was also on the opening slide. This is a theological scholarly work created in the 12th century, which heavily features animals in allegorical roles. And like we might find in older folkloric traditions in Europe, the animals are associated with different behavioral traits. Both of the films we analyzed in this chapter demonstrate that the Shinto and Buddhist themes remain central in contemporary popular output. Whilst Ghost in the Shell draws ideas and themes more explicitly from evolutionary science as well. The storyline in Ghost in the Shell is thematically centered on the intersection of religion, post-humanism, and transhumanism. And in this chapter, we highlight that this is a key disjuncture between Japanese and Western sci-fi, concluding that by reflecting on how the centrality of religious influences in manga and anime has shaped the genre's incorporation of evolutionary themes. So basically, we show that there is this line of continuity from original artwork in Japan that centered the animals in these Shinto and Buddhist stories, right through to modern manga and anime. And as modern manga and anime has become more interested in scientific themes and evolutionary ideas, is actually reinterpreted the science through this cultural lens of familiarity. So the audiences are familiar with, the coded role of certain animals in these stories. We posit that this ability to interrogate questions pertaining to evolutionary ethics and the future of humanity within a religious moral framework is a central component of Japanese manga and anime's global appeal. Now, in developing this chapter, one of the things we got from some reviewers is why we weren't focusing on some Japanese content that has more explicitly evolutionary content. And part of the reason we chose these two films is because they were perhaps the two biggest international successes, or two of the biggest international successes from Japan. And therefore, we wanted to think about ideas being translated and moving around the world. In these case studies, especially in Spirited Away, animals are central protagonists. More broadly, Japanese manga and anime uses many of the traditional depictions of animal characters prevalent in key Shinto and Buddhist works. So we have things like foxes in Pokemon, we have dogs in Inuyasha, rabbits in Urusu Yatsura, for anyone who's familiar with this genre of work, and frogs in Spirited Away, the case we use in this chapter. Many contemporary Japanese manga and anime feature the same animals as originally depicted in the Shoujo Giga scrolls from the 12th century. And scholars have shown that the tradition of personifying animals and the cultural associations which go with each species have been consistently maintained across the ages, from Shoujo Giga to today. And based on the animistic principles of Shintoism, Japanese culture has a respectful and even reverential attitude, not just to non-human animals, but also to inanimate objects. So beyond the living world, objects such as rocks are regularly imbued with spiritual qualities. And once again, the effects of this spiritual tradition can be seen in Japanese popular culture, including in manga and anime. Interestingly, the etymology of the English words animism and anime are the same Latin word anima, which, as many of you will know, means soul. Whether animal or inanimate object, there are many Japanese legends and myths concerning non-human subjects which have been reimagined as manga or anime over recent decades. One of the most successful examples of modern Japanese anime that showcases this cultural and spiritual influence is Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away, the film on the left of your slide here, in which humans are depicted as in chaos and non-humans are the symbols of the pure spirit. Although I'm kind of limited in my time today, so I can't go into a huge synopsis of these films, other than just to say you should watch them if you haven't seen them already. Particularly Spirited Away, I think it will appeal to a very wide audience. Some of the themes and ideas in that film are great. But I wanted to give you a couple of sort of takeaways from this case study. While evolutionary themes are often secondary to religious iconography and storylines in Japanese anime, they're nonetheless important to the genre's discussion of science and technology. In its critique of Western influences and capitalism, Spirited Away looks backwards, and therefore its evolutionary themes centered on transformation, rebirth, and progress are dealt with through a traditional religious lens. In contrast, Ghost in the Shell critique contemporary Japanese culture by looking forwards. In doing so, it centers a technological exploration of progress and the future of humanity, a thoroughly transhumanist framing. And here we see a glimpse of how the centrality of religious influences on manga and anime formats has also shaped how the genre incorporates and deals with evolutionary ideas. We argue that this religious moral framework, which features so prominently in many anime films, imbues these pop culture movies with a depth not commonly found in animated films elsewhere. And using these well-known narratives and their accompanying iconography, writers and directors like Miyazaki and Mamoru Oshii, who directed Ghost in the Shell, are able to interrogate questions pertaining to evolutionary ethics and the future of humanity. And this stable moral framework and the myriad possibilities of animated fictional worlds, they combine to give Japanese manga and anime the ability to explore abstract implications of our technological development in a very popular format. And we argue in this chapter that this combination is central to Japanese manga and anime's global export and popularity. Okay, so just to conclude and hopefully bring some of these themes together, and I hope that hasn't been too much of a wild jump around a few different areas of my research and literature. I just wanted to, I put this image here because the difficulties I've had in categorization just for this panel, something I knew so well, like those British broadcasts, and then trying to think of them through a new lens and think about animals. This panel on the slide here is from a comic that was produced in 2019 by the illustrator Jordan Culver. This was actually another output from the Science and Religion Project. And I just thought it kind of summed up some of my struggles in bringing this together. But just to conclude and draw some of these themes together, we may expect that the depiction of animals in popular media and evolution would fall into a neat binary. That is, that scientific depictions of animals would be materialistic and mechanistic, whilst religious depictions would be allegorical and symbolic. And in some cases, this is true, but we also see instances where this is not true. The popularity of the evolutionary epic and its utilization of animal imagery in British science broadcasting across the 20th century and beyond shows us that secular evolutionary frameworks have also drawn on emotive use of animal imagery. And likewise, the use of racial science and pseudo-child psychology to uphold religious division and boundaries in stories of Indian feral children highlights that the use of animals by religious individuals in these stories could equally be mechanistic and functional, their role simply to dehumanize or to other the non-Christian. And finally, in Japanese anime and manga, we are reminded of the importance of diverse global perspectives when thinking about science and religion. Here we find the central roles of animals in both Shinto and Buddhist traditions, has shaped not only their centrality in some of the most popular films globally of the late 20th century, but also has shaped how evolution has been dealt with in major franchises from the genre. And by connecting these case studies to the wider trends in scholarship on the history of science and religion, I hope I have made the case that for global histories of science and religion to really incorporate complexity, whilst also remaining comparatively useful, scholarship must center local cultural practices, whether through the nuance of local religious denominations, whether that's local media structure and formats, or indeed a society's cultural affinity with animals. I will finish there, and thank you for listening, and I appreciate any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for an extremely rich lecture. I got the impression there that you were just giving us the tip of a huge iceberg, or a kind of polar ice cap, really, of what possibly could be done with that theme of non-human animals in the media. So I'm sure there's many things that we could ask about that. So I have the roving mic. Who would like to open with questions, please? Well, maybe I can start then. I got the impression that what you gave us were two quite small examples of a much wider range of topics. So could you tell us, first of all, where do you think you'll take this next?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I mean, I will have to thank the conference organizers, really, because that was where the prompt to interrogate animals specifically more deeply came from. In my book, in the monograph work, I obviously thought a lot about visual imagery. I thought a lot about the construction of these documentaries and other shows, where producers were spending a lot of time on that. But I didn't necessarily separate out whether that was, them demonstrating using inanimate objects versus live animals. So actually, that's really brought a new lens to how I think about this work. And as the international volume comes to an end, myself and my collaborator will have been thinking a little bit about the next direction. So I think thinking about that representation of animals, I think I'm very interested in something I've spoken about, and it took me a while to persuade others, but I think people are coming along with now, is that I'm interested in evolutionary themes. So I'm not always just interested in these instances where we've had very people educational content where people are trying to teach people about evolutionary biology. I'm interested in these spaces where it spills over. So I'm interested in, how regeneration is discussed in science fiction is one of the themes that comes in my book. So I think thinking about some of these things, both the global work, but also in British broadcasting through the lens of animals, helps us to think about the kind of the work that these are being put to. And I think that's a direction I'd like to explore more for sure. And I think that helps me with my kind of aim of thinking about how an idea like evolution influences all aspects of society.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of questions have started to appear. Let's come over here.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm no expert on evolution, but I remember encountering in a couple of places the idea that because the first thing of Darwin's that came out of copyright was, of course, his first edition, that was the one that was influential. And that was the one where some of the later mitigations and sort of evolutions of his own thought were not present. And therefore, the culturally pervasive ideas of evolution that we are now stuck with are really quite sort of free of the nuance that Darwin himself added later. What do you feel? I mean, do you feel that the cultural sort of pervasiveness of evolution is profoundly sort of barren or weird in various ways?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think, I think in essence that the opening part there is partly correct, and I think this is something that not even just the first edition issue and the later edition issues, but it is an issue for if we're thinking about broadcasting on complex subjects. The process of creating a broadcast is always going to be reduction. We're always trying to take something quite complex, quite messy, and we're always trying to then package it into a nice narrative arc that can, someone can listen to while they're on a train, or someone can, be doing feeding the kids and still interpret and take in. So there's always going to be this element of reduction and smoothing that happens in that process. But we kind of see that in content, like educational broadcasting on the BBC is perhaps the only exception in the British stuff I've examined, where there is the space to go into depth. There is the space. So, by the 1980s, 1990s, they're not really referencing Darwin's work in a scientific context there. They're using more cutting edge work. But actually in popular content, we kind of get stuck on the late 19th century figureheads and then some of the sort of mid 20th century figureheads of the evolutionary synthesis. And the content kind of doesn't always move then. And so we're having debates, but we're not always having debates based on the latest scientific understandings. We're having debates on this kind of cultural version of them. And then, once that spills into lots of areas beyond biology and even beyond the natural sciences, then we're really, for me, into very interesting areas. And there's some very small examples of things like Radio 4 debate panels and things like that, where we stray into these spaces, but much, much harder to kind of have something that's kind of got a kind of central, clear narrative arc that's going to have the huge audiences. So we're spilling into areas like evolutionary ethics, and evolutionary philosophy, and things like this. I think it's very hard to kind of control that. And today, the concept is quite pervasive across lots of areas. I think the popularity of that meme about most adaptable to change, and you can look for who's sharing that online. I've looked through things like LinkedIn and Twitter and analyzed that a little bit. And it's almost always someone coming from a business, if we're looking at academic sharing it or where it's used in that way, it's always almost from a kind of business school or a business frame that they're using that. And it kind of shows that co-option to their needs. I think as far as where some of that comes from, I think the idea of the evolutionary epic is quite a powerful one. The narrative that Julian Huxley shapes, and also Jacob Bronowski, who I deal with in my book through his really hugely popular series, The Ascent of Man, they create this kind of narrative that I think both of them feel can kind of become a secular version of the kind of grand cosmologies of traditional religion.
My question is very similar to the previous one. To some extent, you may have already answered it, but to what extent do you think global media in different countries have either capitulated to or resisted the kind of metaphysical extra baggage of evolutionism? So in other words, because evolution is true, therefore other things are also true, but that's not science. So, Richard Dawkins is kind of extra narrative that's added to simple scientific portrayal.
There's some interesting examples. Let me just take the slides back to the full chapter overview of the global collection. There's some very interesting examples, and in developing this collection, we kind of did that usual process that many historians go through for this. We put out a lot of invites to people we knew. We asked for people to know, to tap other people on shoulders. And we kind of gave people quite a broad remit. And we sort of said, we didn't want to come with some presumed flashpoints for the kind of context that they were working on. We wanted to try and get away from centering just conflict. So we let people kind of come with their own ideas and things. And we had a workshop. It ended up being online because of the pandemic, but we were really bowled over by the breadth of the kind of interactions, and in particular, the strength of the geopolitical aspects that came through all of these case studies. And so when we were sort of thinking like, what hangs this volume together, and what brings, these across all these different media formats, across all these different times and places, what brings us together? And really what that was this element of whether it was governments or social institutions, it kind of changed, but their the way they tried to use evolution and religion to kind of shape their own ends, to get their own ends, was really evident. And I think the one that really comes to mind in this regard is chapter 7 there, which is by Clara Florenza from Barcelona. And this is a chapter about something I wasn't aware of. Some of you there may be aware of it. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, the Franco government convened a series of high-level discussions, of workshops, not too dissimilar to how you guys are meeting in Cambridge, other than the fact that they were held at a huge Franciscan monastery. And the whole point of these workshops was to bring together all the greatest thinkers and to come up with a version of evolution that would be okay for the Catholic hierarchy of the country, but would also fit the Franco government's needs and aims as an authoritarian dictatorship running the country. And they tried to come up with what they were calling the Southern School of Evolutionary Science. So they sort of, and this was really interesting. And this kind of all seems to be triggered because a Spanish scientist, Ocha, won the Nobel Prize. And so the Franco government was receiving a lot of international pressure, and they wanted to promote that a Spaniard had won the Nobel Prize. But then they also started to realize that some of the things he worked on fly directly in the face of how they organized their country. It wasn't necessarily, I don't think, the religious ramifications that they were so interested in. It was more the way they organized society and the social controls they implemented. So they kind of came up with this series of high-profile talks and invited selected press along as well to kind of narrate the story and the discussions. I don't know if that answers completely, but I think what we did see is kind of almost every kind of relationship that you could think of between political authority, religious authority, and scientific authority, the interactions between them in these different contexts. We saw them in almost every configuration. So we see context where science was completely repressed in the name of religion. We see times where Western science was rejected and new forms of evolutionary science were sought. So that the case study on Turkey shows that a little bit, where there was attempts to move away from a full acceptance of Darwinian evolution and find new versions and new interpretations. So we see lots of configurations, but quite often it's utilizing epistemological discussion. It's utilizing philosophical reflections to further political and social agendas.
Time for one last question. I think you have an online question.
Brilliant, thank you. Have you looked at the political influence on the debate, such as the attacks on Erasmus Darwin in such publications as For the Love of Triangle?
The short answer is no. I would love to learn more. I don't know so much about that, unfortunately. Erasmus Darwin is an interesting figure, and I've become increasingly interested in the figureheads that have got forgotten in evolutionary science. So if we think, and I've kind of the process of Darwin eclipsing everything, and why Darwin's a figurehead. So more recently, I've been collaborating on a volume with my colleagues Ian Hesketh and Joel Barnes in Australia at the University of Queensland. And this project is looking at commemoration of Darwin, the anniversary events, and the way that Darwin's been celebrated. And part of the themes coming out of that work are kind of why evolution starts with Darwin, when we have generations of thinkers and scholars before him working on evolution, both in scientific traditions, but also in philosophical traditions. And the fact that one of those is, a direct relation of Darwin, but has been, largely erased from popular accounts, is of great interest to me. But as for the recent interpretations of his work, I'm not familiar, unfortunately. But I will look them up now.
Well, we've got to the end of our time. Alexander, thank you so much for that. Well, we need to stop at this point, and I want to wish you the very best with how you continue that project, because it seems as though, like I said at the beginning, that there are so many different ways you could continue to carry that on. So let's say a big thank you to Alexander now.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.